the second part of our discussion about the Apostle Paul, man and the myth, if you like. Paul describes himself as a Pharisee in Philippians 3:5, who had advanced in Judaism beyond his peers. In Galatians 1:4 talks about that anyway, and who was extremely zealous for the law. However, before 70 CE, it is really, to the best of our knowledge, only in Jerusalem that one could find such a centre for advanced learning in Torah, in the law. Hengel adds that the Pharisees were a Palestinian holiness movement who would not associate with the Gentiles, let alone think that you could study Torah in the uncleanness of a foreign land. Paul describes his preaching in Romans 15:19 as having spread from Jerusalem all round to Illyricum, which could be interpreted as indicative of a Jerusalem starting point, in other words, consistent with Luke's picture. Some object to that on the basis of Galatians 1:22, where Paul says he was unknown to the Judean churches. But Hengel again points out that Jerusalem was no village. It had an estimated population of 80,000 people, and Paul's prior opposition was mainly, he argues, constrained to the Hellenistic Jewish converts, the Hellenistai, to the Christ movement. So in other words, the Jewish believers the Hebraei might not have known him particularly well in terms of any sort of first-person acquaintance. Besides, Paul does not deny they'd heard of him in Galatians 1, quite the contrary, since we must assume they understood who was meant by the phrase, the man, as Paul puts it, who formerly persecuted us. Let's look at another issue here, which is Paul's citizenship, which gets called into question, and his names. A common view of Paul, again based on Acts, is that he was a Roman and Tarsan citizen. This has been questioned, but even Gerd Ludemann, a scholar who is generally very sceptical of the historical value of the Book of Acts, accepts Paul's Roman citizenship. Paul does not mention it in his letters, but really wasn't likely to, given the purpose of writing those letters. More controversial is the idea that he was a citizen of Tarsus, but again, David Horror indicates that the jury really is still out on that question. I say see no particular reason, proven reason to doubt Luke's record on that matter. Related to this question is the issue of Paul's name, because it's only Luke who tells us that his name had been Saul, although neither Luke or Paul claim, as is commonly believed, that his name changed on conversion. It's actually later on in Acts 13:9 from then on that he's referred to as Paul in the Book of Acts, and interestingly that ties in very well with his first significant convert, one Sergius Paulus, who is the Roman proconsul of the island of Cyprus. I don't think that's a coincidence. We could go on and discuss his trade and marital status and so on, but space being limited, we need to explore his persecution of the church before we tackle the also controversial area of his conversion. That Paul persecuted the early Christ movement is a fact we can be certain of, coming both from the pens of Luke and Paul. Luke tells us much more and is largely the source of the popular Christian tradition, with his description of Paul as a murderous opponent who approved the killing of Stephen, Acts 8:1, ravaged the church in Jerusalem, dragging believers off to prison, Acts 8:3, and causing all except the apostles to be scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria, Acts 8:1 again. In Acts 26, verse 10, Luke has Paul, in a speech to King Agrippa, tell how he had not only locked up many of the saints in prison in Jerusalem, but he did so with the authority of the chief priests. Moreover, he had also cast his vote for their execution and punished them in the synagogues, pursuing them even to foreign cities. Paul described himself his intense persecution of the church in Galatians 1:13 and in Philippians 3:6. But some doubt Luke's description of his activity in Jerusalem, but more particularly the extent of his authority and the degree of his persecuting, which seems contrary to what the Romans would permit. The suspicion is that Luke is exaggerating Paul's prior opposition in order to heighten the impact of his conversion. Hengel agrees with Hooker on this particular point, and it must, I think, be readily admitted that Luke goes beyond any corroborating evidence that we possess. At any rate, we do know that Paul certainly had been a fierce opponent and destroyer of the church by his own admission. The popular picture of Paul the persecutor is possibly exaggerated. I don't know, Luke may be right, but surely not greatly mistaken. But why did he so fiercely attack the Christians, and more particularly why did he particularly fiercely attack that which he then came to later live for and die for, if we believe church tradition? His own reasons stated above are linked into his zeal for Torah. Martin Hengel highlights two aspects of the Christ movement, specifically the Hellenists, the Greeks, in his view, that's the Greek converts from Judaism, that provoked Paul's antipathy. On his albeit somewhat speculative view, the Hellenist Jewish believers were likely on a journey away from the law, from Torah and the temple, for which the seeds had already been planted by the teaching of Jesus. This would have threatened Paul's Pharisaic hopes for a pure Israel, obedient and loyal to Torah and Jewish sensibilities connected with the centrality of the temple as the focus of cultic worship. The second offensive element, argues Hengel, was the scandalon of the cross, the idea of a crucified Messiah, since that entailed the belief that the Messiah was accursed in being hanged on a tree. The idea going back to Deuteronomy. We can infer from this, from his own observation, at the offence the Jews took at the claim in his letters. We can assume that he previously had also felt the same way as a Jew about this scandalous idea of the Messiah being accursed, hanging from a tree on the cross. Let's turn now to Paul's conversion, Damascus and beyond. We come now to the vexed question of his conversion. The debate in scholarly circles is over whether or not we should consider Paul to have converted at all, or whether it might not be more accurate to call his transformation a call akin to Jeremiah's call, Jeremiah 1:5, from before birth. And Paul uses a similar language in Galatians 1:15-16. This idea that God who'd known him from his birth at the right time revealed his Son in him. We'll come back to this. I'm going to stop there and come back to a new video in a moment.